Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I will be reading from the second part of Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. Last week, I covered the arrival of Cortez to the New World, his finding of two interpreters, and his march from the coast into the inner parts of Mexico, or back then New Spain, and the conquest of the Tlaxcalans. There was a huge battle between him and the Tlaxcalans. If you didn't catch the first part, you can go check it out on my YouTube channel under William Ramsey Investigates. Thank you. Quote, after a repose of 17 days in Tlaxcala, it was determined to prosecute our march to Mexico. Upon this subject, much difference of opinion existed, the rich settlers of Cuba being very adverse to it. The resolution which we had taken grieved our friends of Tlaxcala, who earnestly advised us by no means to trust Montezuma or his people, nor their smooth and courteous words and manners, for that they were treacherous in the extreme, and would either retain us to breed men for Montezuma's service, or in a favorable hour would fall upon us and destroy us. But in case of our having hostilities with them, they advised us to kill all, neither sparing or the rising youth, nor the aged counselor. Cortez thanked and proposed to them an amicable treaty with their neighbors the Mexicans, but they would not hear of this, saying that they could not trust those, who would only under a veil of peace better execute their treacherous designs. In regard to our road, the Mexican ambassadors earnestly recommended that by Cholula, but our friends of Tlaxcala as strongly advised us by no means to go that way, but by Huachingo. Nevertheless, we determined to go by Cholula, intending to remain there until we could by negotiation obtain a peaceable entry into Mexico. Cortez therefore lent messengers to that place to inform the chiefs of his intention, and expressing his dissatisfaction that they had not come to wait upon him. At this time arrived four of the principal nobility of Mexico with a rich present. It consisted of gold to the value of 10,000 crowns, and 10 bales of the finest mantles of feathers. Having saluted Cortez with the profoundest respect, the ambassadors delivered the message of their monarch, which was to this effect: that he wondered at our stay amongst a people so poor and base as the Tlaxcalans, who were robbers, and unfit even for slaves, and he earnestly requested that we would immediately visit his capital. Cortez replied, assuring them that he would shortly pay his respects to the great Montezuma, requesting their stay with him during the interval. He also determined to send 2 cavaliers as ambassadors to wait on Montezuma and view the city of Mexico. The persons he pitched on were Pedro de Alvarado and B. Vasquez de Tapia. They set out on their journey, accompanying the former Mexican ambassadors who had hitherto continued with us. I was at this time ill of my wounds and of a fever, and therefore incapable of observing exactly all that passed, but I know that their going thither appeared to us a very unwise measure, and in consequence of our remonstrances, they were recalled. The chiefs of Cholula now sent us 4 men of low condition, with a very dry and uncourteous answer to our message, and without any present whatsoever. This evidently appeared to be done in contempt, and Cortez sent notice to them that if their chiefs did not wait upon him in 3 days, they should be considered as rebels, that in the case of their compliance he would be happy to esteem them as brothers, and had much to tell them of great importance. They then sent word that they dare not come amongst the enemies of the Tlaxcalans, who they knew had misrepresented them and the great Montezuma to us, but they requested that we would visit their city, where they would give us an honorable reception. When the Tlaxcalans saw our determination to accept this proposal, they told us that since we were resolved to neglect their advice, they expected that we would take with us 10,000 of their best warriors. This was thought, too, a great number for a peaceable visit. We, however, agreed to take 2,000, which were immediately ready to attend us. Being well prepared against whatever might happen, we now set out on our march, and arrived in the evening at a river, distant a short league from Cholula, where a stone bridge is now built across it. Here some of the chiefs of the city came to congratulate us on our arrival. Continuing our march on the next day, when we came near the city, we were met by the chiefs and priests all in a body, all dressed in cassocks of cotton, resembling those of the Zapotecans. The chiefs presented their incense to Cortez, and after apologizing for not having gone to Tlaxcala, requested that he would not permit so large a body of their enemies to enter the city. This appearing reasonable, Cortez sent Alvarado and Dioli to desire our allies to hut themselves in the field, and we then marched on, attended only by the Indians of Sempoal and those who drew the artillery. Before he entered the city, he made known to those people the objects of his mission, as had already been frequently related. They replied without hesitation that, to our monarch, they were perfectly ready to yield immediate obedience, which they did. But as to that, abandoning their ancient religion, they could not comply with any such demand. When we entered their city, we were concluded through an immense crowd which filled the streets and terraces to our quarters in some large apartments, which contained us, our allies of Sempoal, and those who conveyed the artillery and baggage. During the time we stayed here, a plot was concerted by the ambassadors of Montezuma for the entry of 20,000 of his troops into this city to fall upon us, and several houses were filled with poles and leathern collars, in which they were to have brought us prisoners to Mexico, but that God was pleased to foil their designs. For the first 2 days we were entertained as well as we could wish, but on the third we received no provisions, nor did either chief of priests make his appearance. The very few inhabitants we saw withdrew from us with a mysterious kind of sneer in their faces, and Cortez at this time, applying to the ambassadors to procure for us some provisions as usual, all that we obtained was a little wood and water conveyed by some old men, who told us that no maize was to be had. On this day ambassadors arrived from Montezuma, who, in very disrespectful terms, forbid our approach to Mexico, and required an immediate answer. Cortez mildly expressed his surprise at this alteration. He made them a present, and requested a short delay, to which they acceded. He then, summoning his soldiers, warned us to be alert, for that he suspected some great treachery. The chiefs having refused to attend him, he immediately sent some soldiers to a great temple hard by our quarters, with orders to bring, as quietly as they could, 2 of the priests. In this they succeeded without any difficulty, and the priests being brought before the general, he made a present to each, and then inquired the reason of these extraordinary appearances. One of them was a person of rank and authority over all the temples of the city, in the manner of a hilltop. This person assured him that if he had an opportunity of speaking to the chiefs, he could persuade them to come, and being dismissed for this purpose, he was as good as his word, for he soon returned accompanied by several of them. Cortez first asked the cause of the change in their behavior. He then demanded an immediate supply of provisions, and also a number of their people for the milking day, to convey the baggage and artillery. The chiefs appeared confounded, but at length promised to send in provisions, though they said he had not been forbidden by Montezuma, that he was not satisfied we should go any farther. Just at this time, 3 of our friends from Sempoal called out to the general, and informed him that they had discovered hard by our quarters pitfalls covered with wood and earth, and that clearing away the earth and looking into them, they had found it set with sharp stakes, that the terraces of all the houses were filled with stones and parapeted with sods, and they had seen a barricade of strong timber in one of the streets. At this instant arrived also 8 Tlascalans from their army which was lying in the old. They warned Cortez against the intended attack, for it had come to their knowledge that the people of the place had, on the preceding night, sacrificed to their war god 7 victims, 5 of whom were children, and they had also observed that they were withdrawing their women, children, and effects from the place. Hereupon Cortez sent orders to the Tlascalans to hold themselves in readiness, and rejoining the chiefs and priests of the town, he desired them to be under no apprehension, but warned them not to deviate from their obedience on pain of instant punishment. He then demanded of them 2,000 of their warriors to accompany him on his march the ensuing day. This they readily promised, thinking that it would tend to facilitate their projects. They therefore took their leave very well contented, and sent notice of our intentions to all those concerned with them. Cortez then sent Donna Marina to bring back the 2 priests with whom he had spoken to. In this she succeeded, and Cortez obtained from them the following intelligence. They told him that Montezuma, on our approach to Mexico, had become very unsettled in his mind, sometimes ordering that we should be received with honor, at other times that we should be not permitted to pass, and that having lately consulted his gods, they had declared that here in Cholula we were all to be put to death, or made prisoners, for which purpose he had sent 20,000 of his troops, 1/2 of which number was in the city, and the other concealed half a league from it. That the plan of their attack was settled, and that 20 of us were allotted to be sacrificed to the gods of Cholula. Cortez rewarded them handsomely, and joining strict secrecy, desired them to bring to him all the chiefs that at the time he appointed. He then summoned a council of the ablest and wisest soldiers of his army, some of whom were returning immediately, and others proposed various measures, but at length all agreed in the necessity of severely punishing this treachery as an example to other people. It was therefore determined that we should carry on the appearance of our intended march, preparing our baggage and concealing our other measures, that within the high walls of the courts where we were quartered, punishment should be inflicted upon the Cholulans. With the ambassadors of Montezuma, it was thought it was most prudent to dissemble. We therefore told them of our having discovered the treason of the people who had aspersed Montezuma, being the author of it, and we proposed to them that they have no more intercourse with the inhabitants, but to retire to the apartment of Cortez. They solemnly declared their ignorance of the transaction, and contrary to their inclination, we now put them under a good guard for the night, during which our whole force remained under arms. On this night, the wife of a cacique, an old woman who was acquainted with the plot, came secretly to Donna Marina, whose appearance had attracted her regard, and invited her to her own house as a place of security from the danger which was ready to overwhelm us, making at the same time a proposal to her to accept as a husband her son, the brother of a boy who accompanied her. Donna Marina, with a profusion of thanks, and with her usual acuteness and pretense of mind, agreed to all that she proposed, but that she wanted someone with whom to entrust her effects. She then obtained information of every particular of the business, all of which the old woman informed her she had learned from her husband, who was chief of one of the divisions of the city, was then with his warriors giving directions for their junction with the Mexican forces. She added that she had known it 3 days before in consequence of presents which had been sent from Mexico to the different chiefs, her husband having received at that time a golden drum. Donna Marina, desiring this woman and her son to remain where they were and take care of her effects, hastened to Cortez and informed him of all that had happened, and that the person from whom she had the information was in her apartment, the consequence of which Cortez immediately sent for her, and the woman, on being brought into his presence, confirmed all that she had said to Donna Marina, which exactly agreed with the other information he had received. When day broke, the hurry of the chiefs, priests, and people, and the satisfaction with which appeared in their countenances, were as great as if they had already had us in their cages. They brought many more of their warriors to attend to us than we had required, insomuch that the courts which remain at this day as a memorial of the event, large as they were, could not contain them. We were all prepared for what was to be done. The soldiers, armed with sword and buckler, were placed at the gate of the great court in order to prevent any one from escaping, and our general was on horseback, attended by a strong guard. When he saw how the people crowded in, he exclaimed, "How anxious are these traitors to feast upon our flesh, but God will disappoint them." He sent directions to the 2 priests who had given the information to go immediately to their houses, and this he did in order to save their lives. Then, causing the rest of the priests and all the chiefs to be brought in, he calmly asked them what was their reason for plotting to destroy us, what we had done, more than require them to abandon their abominable customs and endeavor to instruct them in the articles of our holy faith, and that for these reasons only they had made preparations to cut us all off. That their evil intentions appeared by their having withdrawn the women from the town, and when we required, they made preparations to cut us all off. They insulted us by sending in wood and water. He said that he knew of the ambuscade that was placed upon the road which they expected us to go, and that the recompense which they intended for our holy and friendly services was to kill and eat us, for which purpose the pots were already boiling, and prepared with salt, pepper, and tomatoes. That if they were determined to attack us, it was better to do it in a manly way, as the Tlascalans did, he added. But he also knew that 20 of us were to be sacrificed to their idols, to whom they had made a propitiatory offering of 7 of their brethren. But the victory the idols had promised them, it was not in their power to give, and the effects of their treason were now ready to fall on their own heads. This being successfully explained to the natives by Donna Marina, they confessed the whole of the charge, and said it was planned entirely by the orders of Montezuma. Cortez replied that such crimes were never suffered to pass without punishment, and he then commanded a musket to be fired as the signal for slaughter, which was waited for us, who were, as I have related, well prepared, and falling upon the multitude then enclosed within the courts, we executed their punishment on them in a manner that they will ever remember. For a number of them were killed by us instantly, and many afterwards burned alive, very contrary to the expectations they had formed from the promises of their gods. About 6,000 Cholulans were put to death on this occasion. Within 2 hours, our allies, the Tlascalans, arrived and made a desperate slaughter of them in the streets. And as soon as the Cholulans had ceased to make resistance, the former ravaged the city, plundering and making them slaves without our having it in our power to prevent them. And on the day after, when the intelligence had reached Tlaxcala, fresh hordes crowded hither for the same purpose. It was now absolutely necessary to restrain them all at all risks. Cortez therefore ordered the chiefs to withdraw their troops, which they immediately did. And soon after, some priests and chieftains who presided over other parts of the town, which they allegedly not have been engaged in the conspiracy, waited on us and requested a remission of punishment. The 2 priests formerly mentioned, the old woman who was so anxious to be the mother-in-law of Donna Marina, came also and petitioned to the same effect. Cortez appeared greatly enraged, and calling for the Mexican ambassadors, declared in their presence that if he did not destroy the whole city as it deserved, it was out of respect to the great Montezuma, whose vassals the inhabitants were, but for his sake he pardoned them. He then commanded the Tlascalans to deliver up those whom they had made prisoners. This, however unwillingly, they in a great measure complied with, many persons being set at liberty, but after all they retained a good booty of gold, mantles, cotton, salt, and slaves. An amnesty for the past being proclaimed, and Cortez having been reconciled the Talascans and the Cholulans. The latter suggested they were apprehensive our general would appoint their new chief, the former one having been put to death. After this attempted treachery by Montezuma, the army under Cortez head towards the capital of Mexico. Early in the morning, when we were on the point of marching, a sentinel came to inform us that a great number of Mexicans, richly dressed, were upon the road. Cortez therefore ordered us to return to our quarters, and at that instant 4 of the principal courtiers of Mexico arrived, and awaiting on Cortez with great respect informed him that Cacamatzin, lord of Tezcuco, the nephew of the great Montezuma, was approaching, and requested that we would wait to receive him. Cacamatzin followed in the greatest pomp, carried in a magnificent litter adorned with green plumes and enriched with jewels, set in the branched pillars of solid gold. He was borne by 8 lords, who assisted him out of the litter and swept the way by which he was to pass. When he came into the presence of Cortez, he said to him, "Malintzin, here am I and those lords to attend you to your residence in our city, by order of the great Montezuma." Cortez embraced the prince and presented him with 3 jewels of that kind called margaritas, which are figured in different colors. We then set forward on the road to Mexico, which was crowded with multitudes of the natives, and arrived at the causeway of Itzapalapa, which leads to that capital. When we beheld the number of populous towns on the water and firm ground, and that broad causeway running straight and level to the city, we could compare it to nothing but the enchanted scenes we had read of in Amadis of Gaul, from the great towers and temples, and other edifices of lime and stone which seems to rise out of the water. To many of us it appeared doubtful whether we were asleep or awake, nor is the manner in which I express myself to be wondered at, for it must be considered that never yet did man see, hear, or dream of anything equal to the spectacle which appeared before our eyes this day. When we approached Itzapalapa, we were received by several great lords of that country, relations of Montezuma, who conducted us to our lodgings there, in palaces magnificently built of stone and timber, which was cedar, and spacious courts and apartments furnished with canopies of the finest cotton. After having contemplated these noble edifices, we walked through the gardens, which were admirable to behold, from the variety of beautiful and aromatic plants, and the numerous alleys filled with fruit trees, roses, and various flowers. Here also was a lake of the clearest water, which communicated with the Grand Lake of Mexico by a channel cut for the purpose, and capable of admitting the largest canoes. The whole was ornamented with works of art, painted and admirably plastered when whitened, and it was rendered more delightful by numbers of beautiful birds. When I beheld the scenes that were around me, I thought within myself that this was the garden of the world. This place was at the time of which I am speaking, with 1/2 of the houses in the water, and the other half on dry land. But all is destroyed, and that which was a lake is now a tract of fields of Indian corn, so entirely altered that the natives themselves could hardly know it. Mexico, November 8th, 1519. On the next day we set out, accompanied as on the former one, and proceeded by the Grand Causeway, which is 8 yards wide, and runs in a straight line to the city of Mexico. It was crowded with people, as were all the towers, temples, and causeways, in every part of the lake, attracted by curiosity to behold men and animals, such as never had been before seen in these countries. We were occupied by very different thoughts. Our number did not amount to 450. We had perfectly in our recollection the accounts we had received on our march, that we were to be put to death on our arrival in the city which we now saw before us, approachable only by causeways, whereupon were several bridges, breaking of one effectually cut off our retreat. And now let who can tell me where are men in this world to be found except ourselves, who would have hazarded such an attempt. When we arrived at a place where a small causeway turns off, which goes to the city of Cuyoacan, we were met by a great number of the lords of the court in their richest dresses, sent as they laid before the great Montezuma to bid us welcome. After waiting there some time, the nephew of Montezuma and other noblemen went back to meet their monarch, who approached, carried in the most magnificent litter, which was supported by his principal nobility. When we came near certain towers which are almost close to the city, Montezuma, who was then there, quitted his litter, and was borne in the arms of the princes of Tezcuco, Itzapalapa, Tacuba, and Cuyoacan, under a canopy of the richest materials, ornamented with green feathers, gold, and precious bones that hung in the manner of a fringe. He was most richly dressed and adorned, and wore buskins of pure gold ornamented with jewels. The princes who supported him were dressed in rich habits, different from those in which they came to meet us, and others who preceded the monarch spread mantles on the ground lest his feet should touch it. All who attended him, except 4 princes, kept their eyes fixed upon the earth, not daring to look him in the face. When Cortez met the great Montezuma, he dismounted from his horse and advanced towards him with much respect. Montezuma bid him welcome, and Cortez replied with a compliment, and it appeared to me that he offered to yield the right hand of Montezuma, who declined it, and put Cortez on his right. Our general then produced a collar of those artificial jewels called margaritas, which are of various colors set in gold, and threw it upon the neck of Montezuma, after which he advanced to embrace him. But the lords who surrounded the monarch, taking him by the arm, prevented him, it appearing to them not sufficiently respectful. Cortez then said that he rejoiced in having seen so great a monarch, that he was highly honored by his coming out to meet him, as well as by the many other marks of his favor. To this Montezuma made a gracious reply, and gave orders to the princes of Tezcatlipoca, Coco, and Coyoacan to attend us to our quarters. Attended by his nobility, we then returned to the city, all the people standing close to the walls, without daring to lift up their eyes, and thus we piled, without obstruction from the crowd. Who could count the multitude of men, women, and children which thronged the streets, canals, and terraces, and tops of the houses on that day? The whole of what I saw on this occasion is so strongly imprinted upon my memory that it appears to me if it had happened only yesterday. Glory to our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave us courage to venture upon such dangers, and brought us safely through them. And praised be he, that he has suffered me to live, to write this my true history, although not fully and satisfactorily as the subject deserves. Our lodgings were provided in the buildings which had been inhabited by the father of Montezuma. Here the monarch had the temples of his gods, and a secret treasure of gold and valuables, which he had derived from his father Axayacca. We were lodged here because, being considered as tules, they thought we were in our proper place among the idols. Be it how it may, however, that here they brought us to lodge in large apartments, a real platform being assigned for our general, and mats for each of us, with little canopies over them, such as are used in that country. The whole of this palace was very light, airy, clean, and pleasant, the entry being through a great court. Montezuma here led Cortez by the hand to the apartment destined for him, and taking a large collar of gold, placed it around the general's neck. Cortez declared his gratitude for these favors, and Montezuma said, "Melanson, here you and your friends are at home. Now repose yourselves." With these words he departed. We were allotted to our quarters by companies. Our artillery was posted in a convenient place, and all was arranged in such a manner as to be prepared for any contingency. A very sumptuous entertainment was provided for us, which we sat down to be with great satisfaction. And here ends the true and full account of our adventurous and magnanimous entry into Mexico on the 8th day of November in the year of our Lord 1519. Glory be to Jesus Christ for all. When the great Montezuma had made his repast, and understood that we had done the same, attended by a great body of his nobility, he came to our apartments. Cortez went out to the middle of the hall to receive him, where Montezuma took him by the hand, and seats richly ornamented being brought, they both sat down, by the desire of the king, who then began a very pertinent speech, wherein he observed that he rejoiced to have in his dominions captains so brave as Cortez and his associates, and that he had before heard of one who had arrived at Champoton, and also of another who had come with 4 ships in the preceding year, that he had been anxious to see them, but had been disappointed. Now, however, that we were arrived, he was happy to offer us all the favor he had in his power to bestow, for we were undoubtedly those who had been mentioned by his ancestors, who had predicted that there would come certain men from that part where the sun rises, to govern these countries. It could be no other but us, who had fought so valiantly since our arrival in their country, a representation of each of our battles having been sent to him. Cortez replied that he and all of us could never repay the great favors we every day received from his hands, that we certainly were those of whom it had been prophesied, and that we were vassals of a potent monarch named Don Carlos, who had many great princes subject to him, and sent us, hearing of the fame and grandeur of King Montezuma, to request his name, that the great Montezuma and his subjects would embrace the holy Christian faith, which is the faith possessed by our monarch, by doing which he would preserve the souls of him, his family, and his subjects, and that he should in good time be informed of more particulars, such as that we worship the only true God, with many other things highly edifying to the hearers. This conversation being concluded, Montezuma presented our general with a quantity of valuable ornaments of wrought gold. To each of the captains he made a present of some gold and 3 loads of mantles, to each soldier 2 loads of richly wrought mantles. And all of this he did in the most free and gracious manner, to speak more properly like a great monarch as he was. Montezuma then asked Cortez if his soldiers were all brothers and vassals of our emperor, to which Cortez replied that we were all brothers in love and friendship, persons of consequence in our country, and servants of our sovereign lord the king. With mutual compliments, Montezuma then departed, having given orders to his officers to provide us amply according to our demands, with corn, stone mills, and women to make bread, together with fowls, fruit, and plenty of grass for the horses. The great Montezuma was at this time aged about 40 years, of good nature, well proportioned and thin. His complexion was much fairer than that of the Indians. He wore his hair short, just covering his ears, with very little beard, well arranged, thin, and black. His face was rather long, with a pleasant countenance, and good eyes. Gravity and good humor were blended together when he spoke. He was very delicate and clean in his person, bathing himself every evening. He had a number of mistresses of the first families, and 2 princesses his lawful wives. When he visited them, it was with such secrecy that none could know except his own servants. He was clear of all suspicion of unnatural vices. The clothes which he wore one day he did not put on for 4 days after. He had 200 of his nobility as a guard, in apartments adjoining his own. Of there, certain persons only could speak to him, and when they went to wait upon him, they took off their rich mantles, and put on others of less ornament but clean. They entered his apartment barefooted, their eyes fixed on the ground, making 3 inclinations of the body as they approached him. In addressing the king, they said, "Lord, my lord, great lord." When they had finished, he dismissed them with a few words, and they retired, with their faces towards him, with their eyes fixed upon the ground. I also observed that when great men came a distance about business, they entered his palace barefooted and in a plain habit. And also they did not enter the gate directly, but took a circuit and headed towards it. His cooks had upwards of 30 different ways of dressing meats, and they had earthen vessels so contrived as to keep them always hot. For the table of Montezuma himself, above 300 dishes were dressed, and for his guards above 1,000. Before dinner, Montezuma would sometimes go out and inspect the preparations, and his officers would point out to him which were the best, and explain of what birds and flesh they were composed, and those of which he would eat. But this was more for amusement than anything else. It is said that at times the flesh of young children was dressed for him, but the ordinary meats were domestic fowls, pheasants, geese, partridges, quails, venison, Indian hogs, pigeons, hares, rabbits, with many other animals and birds peculiar to the country. This is certain, that after Cortez had spoke to him relative to the dressing of human flesh, it was not practiced in his palace. At his meals, in the cold weather, a number of torches of the bark of a wood which makes no smoke and has an aromatic smell were lighted, that they should not throw too much heat. Screens ornamented with gold, painted with figures of idols, were placed before them. Montezuma was seated on a low throne or chair at a table proportioned to the height of his seat. The table was covered with white cloths and napkins, and 4 beautiful women presented him with water for his hands, in vessels which they called chicales, and other vessels under them like plates, to catch the water. They also presented him with towels. Then 2 other women brought small cakes of bread, and when the king began to eat, a large screen of wood gilt was placed before him, so that people should not during that time see him. The women having retired a little distance, 4 ancient lords stood by the throne, to whom Montezuma from time to time spoke or addressed questions, and as a mark of particular favor, gave to each of them a plate of that which he was eating. I was told that these old lords, who were his near relations, were also counselors and judges. The plates which Montezuma presented to them, they received with the highest respect, eating what was in them without taking their eyes off the ground. He was served on earthenware of Cholula, red and black. While the king was at table, none of his guards or in the vicinity of his apartment dared for their lives make any noise. Fruit from all kinds of that the country produced was laid before him. He ate very little, but from time to time a liquor prepared from cocoa and of a stimulative or corroborative quality, as we were told, was presented to him in golden cups. We could not at that time see if he drank it or not, but I observed a number of jars above 50 brought in, filled with foaming chocolate, which he took some, which the women presented to him. At different intervals during the time of dinner, there entered certain Indians, humpbacked, very deformed, and ugly, who played tricks of buffoonery, and others who said they were jesters. There was also a company of singers and dancers who afforded Montezuma much entertainment. To these he ordered the vases of chocolate be distributed. The 4 female attendants then took away the cloths, and again with much respect presented him with water to wash his hands, during which time Montezuma conversed with the 4 old noblemen formerly mentioned, after which they took their leave with many ceremonies. One thing I forgot, and no wonder to mention in its place, is that during the time Montezuma sat at dinner, 2 very beautiful women were busily employed making small cakes with eggs and other things mixed therein. These were delicately white, and when they were presented to him on plates covered with napkins. Also another kind of bread was brought to him in long loaves, and plates of cakes resembling wafers. After he had dined, he presented with him 3 little canes highly ornamented, containing liquid amber, mixed with an herb they called tobacco. And when he had sufficiently viewed and heard the singers, dancers, and buffoons, he took a little of the smoke of one of these canes, and then laid himself down to sleep, and thus his principal meal concluded. After this was over, all of his guards and domestics sat down to dinner. As near as I could judge, above 1,000 plates of those eatables I have mentioned were laid before them, with vessels foaming of chocolate, of fruit in immense quality. For his women inferior servants, his establishment was of a prodigious expense. We were astonished amidst such a profusion of the vast regularity that prevailed. His major domo was at this time a prince named Tapia. He kept the accounts of Montezuma's rents in books which accompanied an entire house. Montezuma had 2 buildings filled with every kind of arms, richly ornamented with gold and jewels, such as shields large and small, clubs like 2-handed swords, and lances much larger than ours, with blades 6 feet in length, so strong that if they fix upon a shield they do not break, and sharp enough to use as razors. There was also an immense quantity of bows and arrows and darts, together with slings and shields rolled up into small compass, and in action they let fall and are therefore cover the whole body. He had also had much defensive armor of quilted cotton, ornamented with feathers and different devices, and cassoques for the head, made of wood and bone, and with plumes of feathers, and many other articles too tedious to mention. In this palace was the most magnificent aviary, which contained every description of birds that continent afforded, namely royal eagles and a smaller species, and with many other birds, down to the smallest paroquets of beautiful colors. It was here that the ornaments of green feathers were fabricated. The feathers were taken from birds which are about the size of our pies in Spain, which they here called quetzales, and other birds whose plumage is of 5 different colors: green, red, white, yellow, and blue. The name of this species of bird I do not know. Here was an immensity of parrots and certain geese of fine plumage, and the species which resembled geese. All these bred here and were stripped of their feathers every year at the proper season. Here was a large pond of clear running water, where a number of great birds, entirely red, with very long legs. There are some like them in the island of Cuba, which they called epiris. There was also a species which lives entirely in the water. We likewise saw another great building, which was a temple, and which contained those which we called the valiant or fighting gods. And here were many kinds of furious beasts, tigers, lions of 2 species, one of which resembles a wolf, called here a div, also foxes and other smaller animals, but all carnivorous. Most of these were bred in the palace, being fed with game, fowls, dogs, as I have heard the bodies of Indians who were sacrificed, the manner of which I have been informed this is. They open the body of the victim while living, with large knives of stone, and they take out his heart and blood, which they offer to their gods. Then they cut off the limbs and the head, upon which they feast, giving the body to be devoured by the wild beasts, and the skulls they hang up in their temples. In this accursed place were many vipers and poisonous serpents, which have in their tails somewhat the sounds of castanets. These are the most dangerous of all, and were kept in vessels filled with feathers, where they reared their young, and were fed with the flesh of human beings and dogs. And I have been allured that after our expulsion from Mexico, all these animals lived for many days upon the bodies of our comrades who were killed on that occasion. These beasts and horrid reptiles were retained to keep company with their infernal gods, and when these animals yelled and hissed, the palace seemed like hell itself. The place where the artist principally resided was named Escapuzalco, and was at the distance about a league from the city. Here were the shops and manufactories of all their gold and silversmiths, whose works in these metals and in jewelry, when they were brought to Spain, surprised our ablest artists. Their painters we may also judge of by what we now see, for there are 3 Indians in Mexico who are named Marcos de Aquino, Juan de la Cruz, and Crespilo, who, if they had lived with the Apelles in ancient times, were compared with Michelangelo or Borgante in modern times, and would not be held inferior to them. When we had been 4 days in Mexico, Cortes wished to take a view of the city, and in consequence went to request the permission of His Majesty. Accordingly, Aguilar, Donna Marina, and a little page of our generals called Orteguilla had already understood something of the language, went to the palace for that purpose. Montezuma was pleased immediately to accede, but being apprehensive that we might offer some insult to his temple, he determined to go thither in person, which he did accordingly, in same form and with the same retinue as when he first came out to meet us, but that he was on this occasion preceded by 2 lords bearing scepters in their hands, which they carried on high, as the signal of the king's approach. Montezuma in his litter, with a small rod in his hand, one half of which was gold, the other half wood, which he bore elevated like a rod of justice, for such it was, approached the temple, and there quitted his litter and mounted the steps, attended by a number of priests, offering incense with many ceremonies to his war gods. Cortes, at the head of his cavalry, and the principal part of our soldiers under arms, marched to the grand square, attended by many noblemen of the court. When we arrived there, we were astonished at the crowds of people and the regularity which prevailed, as well as the vast quantities of merchandise which those who attended us were assiduous in pointing out. Each kind had its particular place, which was distinguished by a sign. The articles consisted of gold, silver, jewels, feathers, mantles, chocolate, skins dressed and undressed, sandals, and other manufactures of the roots and fibers of neckwen, and great numbers of male and female slaves, some of which were fastened by the neck in collars to long poles. The meat market was stocked with fowl, game, and dogs. Vegetables, fruits, articles of food, ready dressed, salt, bread, honey, and sweet pastry and made in various ways were also sold there. Other places in the square were appointed to the sake of earthenware, where wooden household furniture stuck tables, benches, firewood, paper, sweet canes filled with tobacco, mixed with liquid amber, copper axes and working tools, and wooden vessels highly painted. Numbers of women sold fish and little loaves made of a certain mud which they find in the lake, which resembles cheese. The makers of stone blades were busily employed shaping them out of rough material, and the merchants who dealt in gold had the metal in grains as it came from the mines, in transparent tubes so that they could be reckoned, and the gold was valued at many mantles, or so many ziquipils of cocoa, according to the size of the quills. The entire square was enclosed in piazzas, under which great quantities of grain were stored, and were also shops of various kinds of goods. I must apologize for adding that boatloads of human waste were on the borders of the adjoining canals for the purpose of tanning leather, which they said could not be done without it. Some may laugh at this, but I assert the fact as I've stated, and moreover, upon all the public roads, places for passengers to resort to were built of canes thatched with straw or grass, in order to collect this material. From the square we proceeded to the great temple, but before we entered it we made a circuit through a number of large courts, the smallest of which appeared to me to contain more ground than the great square in Salamanca, with double enclosures built of lime and stone, and the courts paved with a large white cut stone, very clean, or where not paved, they were plastered and polished. When we approached the gate of the great temple, to the flat summit of which the ascent was by 114 steps, and before we had mounted one of them, Montezuma sent down to us 6 priests and 2 of his noblemen to carry Cortes up, as they had done their sovereign, which he politely declined. When we ascended to the summit of the temple, we observed on the platform as we passed the large stones upon which were placed the victims who were to be sacrificed. Here was a great figure which resembled a dragon, and much blood, fresh spilt. Montezuma came out from an auditory in which his accursed idols were placed, and attended by 2 priests, and addressing himself to Cortes, expressed his apprehensions that he was fatigued, to which Cortes replied that fatigue was unknown to us. Montezuma then took him by the hand and pointed out to him the different parts of the city and its vicinity, all of which were commanded from that place. Here we had a clear prospect of the 3 causeways by which Mexico communicated with the land, and of the aqueduct of the Chapultepec, which was supplied the city with the finest water. We were struck by the numbers of canoes passing to and from the mainland, loaded with provisions and merchandise, and we could now perceive in this great city that all others of that neighborhood which were built on the water, the houses stood separate from each other, communicating only by small drawbridges and by boats, and they were built with terraced tops. We observed also the temples and adoratories of the adjacent cities, built in the form of towers and fortresses, and others on the causeway, all whitewashed and wonderfully brilliant. The noise and bustle of the marketplace below us could be heard almost a league off, and those who had been at Rome and Constantinople said that for convenience, regularity, and population they had never seen the like. Cortes, then addressing himself to Montezuma, requested that he would do him the favor to show us his gods. Montezuma, having first consulted his priests, led us into a tower where there was a kind of a saloon. Here there were 2 altars highly adorned with richly wrought timbers on the roof, and over the altars gigantic figures resembling very fat men. The one on the right was Huitzilopochtli, their war god, with a great face and terrible eyes. This figure was entirely covered with golden jewels, and his body bound with golden serpents. In his right hand he held a bow, in his left a bundle of arrows. The little idol which stood by him represented his page, and bore a lance and target richly ornamented with gold and jewels. The great idol had round his neck the figures of human heads and hearts, made of pure gold and silver, ornamented with precious stones of a blue color. Before the idol was a pan of incense, with 3 hearts of human victims, which they were then burning, mixed with copal. The whole of that apartment, both the walls and the floor, was stained with human blood in such quantity as to give a very offensive smell. On the left was another great figure, with a countenance like a bear, and great shining eyes, of the polished substance whereof their mirrors are made. The body of this idol was also covered with jewels. These 2 deities, it was said, were brothers. The name of this last was Tezcatlipoca, and he was the god of the infernal regions. He presided, according to their notions, over the souls of men. His body was covered with figures representing little devils with tails of serpents, and the walls and pavement of this temple were so besmeared with blood that they stunk worse than all the slaughterhouses of Castile. An offering lay before him of 5 human hearts. In the summit of the temple, in a recess the timber of which was the most highly ornamented, we saw a figure half human and half resembling an alligator, inlaid with jewels and partially covered with a mantle. This idol was said to contain the germ, the origin of all created things, and was the god of the harvest and fruits. The walls and altars were bestained like the rest, and so offensive that we thought we could never get out soon enough. In this place they had a drum of the most enormous size, the head of which was made of the skins of large serpents. The instrument, when struck, resounded with a noise that could be heard to the distance of 2 leagues, and so doleful was it that it deserved to be named the music of the infernal regions. And with their horrible-sounding horns and trumpets, their great knives for sacrifice, their human victims, and their blood-besprinkled altars, I devoted them in all their wickedness to God's vengeance, and thought the time would never arrive that I should escape from this scene of human butchery, horrible smells, and more detestable sights. Cortez, half in jest, addressing himself to Montezuma, expressed his wonders so wise a prince could worship so absurd and wicked powers, and proposed to him to place on the summit of that tower a cross, and in those adoratories the image of the Holy Virgin, and he assured him that he would then be soon convinced of the vanity and deception of his idols. Montezuma shooed off marks of displeasure at these expressions, saying that he would not have admitted us to the temple had he thought that we would have insulted their gods, who were kind to them, who gave them health and seasonable rains, good harvests, fine weather, victories, and whatever else they desired, and whom they were in duty and in gratitude bound to worship. Cortez dropped the discourse, observing that it was time for us to go, and Montezuma, assenting, said it was necessary for him to remain to expiate by sacrifice the sin which he had committed in admitting us there. Cortez then took leave, and thus we concluded our visit to the great temple of Mexico, descending the steps with much pain to our invalid suffering by the disease ascribed to Hispaniola. Bernal Diaz continues, quote, I will now proceed to relate other matters in which, if I am not so correct as I ought to be, let it be remembered that my situation was that of a soldier who is obliged to be more attentive to the orders of his officer than to the objects of curiosity around him. The ground whereupon this temple stood was as much as 6 of the largest buildings of this country occupy. From the base it diminished to the summit, whereupon was a tower in which the idols were placed, and from the middle of the ascent to the top were 5 concavities like barbicans, but without parapets. However, there are many paintings of temples in the possession of the conquerors, one of whereof I have, and those who have seen them will easily form an idea of the outside of this temple. I have heard that at the time they laid the foundations of it, the natives of that country all made offerings of their gold, silver, and jewels, of the seeds of the earth, and of the prisoners, all of which were buried in the foundations of the building. The inquisitive reader will naturally ask how I came to know anything of this plan, which happened upwards of 1,000 years ago. I will inform him. When we got possession of this great city, and that it was to be built upon a new plan, it was determined to place the church of St. Iago on the ground where this temple stood, and in sinking the foundations we found great quantities of gold, silver, and other valuables, and a Mexican who obtained part of the same ground discovered more treasure, about which there was a lawsuit in support of His Majesty's right, the result of which I am ignorant of. The account was also confirmed by Guatemotzin, who was then alive, and who said that the transaction was recorded in their ancient historical paintings. The church which now stands here is called St. Iago y Tlatuelco. This temple, I have before observed, was surrounded by courts as large as the square of Salamanca, inside of a double enclosure of lime and stone. At a little distance from it stood a tower, a true hell or habitation for demons, with a mouth resembling that of an enormous monster, wide open and ready as it were to devour those who entered. At the door stood frightful idols, and by it was a place for sacrifice, and within boilers and pots full of water to dress the flesh of the victims, which was eaten by the priests. The idols were like serpents and devils, and before them were tables and knives for sacrifice, the place being covered with the blood which was spilt on those occasions. The furniture was like that of a butcher stall, and I never give this accursed building any name except that of hell. Having passed this, we saw great piles of wood and a reservoir of water supplied by a pipe from the great aqueduct. And crossing a court, we came to another temple, wherein were the tombs of Mexican nobility. It was begrimed with soot and blood. Next to this was another full of skeletons and piles of bones, each kept apart, but regularly arranged. In each temple were idols, and in each had its also particular priests, who wore long vestments of black, somewhat between the dress of the Dominicans and our canons. Their long hair was clotted together, and their ears lacerated in honor of their gods. At a certain distance from the buildings of which I had last spoken were others, the idols of which were, as they lay, the advocates or superintendent deities of human marriages, and all round the great court were many houses, which were not very lofty, and wherein resided the priests, and others who had charge of the idols. Here was also a great reservoir of water, supplied with pipes exclusively for the service of the two idols Huitzilopochtli and Tacataputa, and hard by a large building were a number of young Mexican women who resided there as in a nunnery until they were married. They worshipped two female deities who presided over marriages, and to them they offered sacrifices in order to obtain good husbands. I have been thus diffuse in my description of the great temple, because it was the most considerable in that city, amongst the many sumptuous buildings of that kind which it contained. The temple of Cholula, however, was higher than this, having 120 steps. It was also held in great veneration and was built upon a plan different from that of Mexico. The temple at Texcoco was very large, having 117 steps. All of these were different structures, but agreed in having a number of outer courts and a double enclosure. One ridiculous circumstance is that in each province had their own particular gods who were supposed to have no concern of any other, so that the idols were innumerable in this country. Having fatigued ourselves with the examination of these scenes, so new to us, we retired to our quarters. Cortez, perceiving how adverse the king was to the conversion of his temple into a Christian church, applied to one of the principal officers of his palace for materials to construct a chapel and altar within our quarters. His desire being made known to Montezuma, it was instantly complied with, and timber and workmen being provided, in 3 days we had it completed. Here we said Mass every day. We had, however, to lament the total want of wine for the Holy Sacrament, it having been all used in the illness of Cortez, the Reverend Father, and others during the wars in Tlaxcala. However, we were constant in our devotions, as well on account of our duty, as in order to impress a proper ideal of our holy religion on the minds of Montezuma and the natives. Being employed in looking out for a proper place to fix the Holy Cross, one of our carpenters observed an appearance on the wall, as if a door had been there, and lately closed up. When this was made known to Cortez, it was privately opened, and upon entering the apartment they found riches without end. The secret soon transpired, and we went, all of us, to view them. I was then a young man, and I thought that if all the treasures of the earth had been brought into one place, they could not have amounted to so much. It was agreed again to close up the door, and we had determined to conceal the knowledge of it until the proper time should offer. All right, that was part 2 of the True History of the Conquest of Mexico by Bernal Diaz de Castillo. It was published sometime in the early 16th century. This sequence, or these scenes, took place in 1519 in the city of what was formerly the Aztec Empire. So it looks like I'll have to do a part 3, which will probably conclude it, but thanks for listening. Have a good night.